Hey everybody, welcome to the 20-Minute Bible Study. I am Vince Miller. And welcome back to this series called Overcomers. You know, the truth is that we have all been overcome by something, whether it be a struggle, a conflict, a defeat, a sin, a temptation, or even a debility. But we are also overcomers in Christ, and today's topic is ownership. You know, ownership is a huge part of becoming an overcomer. It means that we not only accept that we need help, but that we're starting to believe the truth about our past, present, and future state. For example, it means owning the decisions we've made, including the friendships, the choices, and the patterns. It means owning the results of the decisions we've made, such as divorce and estrangement, loss of job, or incarceration. It means ownership for the hope that we want to have, that we want to have a better tomorrow, and we're not doing it for somebody else. And it means understanding the contributing issues like trauma and emotions, mental health, fear, and shame that may underline all these things. You know, when we think ownership, we tend to only focus on the choices we have made, and there's often a whole lot more. The tricky part of ownership and ongoing recovery is really trust. It's being able to describe and own the issues with a great degree of precision, and it's freeing. Yet not believable always to those that we have lost trust with. But starting to own them is courageous. Understanding how to take responsibility requires even more courage. And we need to accept the issues more than just fix the problems. Most want to fix the issues too quickly rather than owning the corrupt belief systems, and even the severe negative impact they're having on others. We all want to get past them, but we also need to learn to own them. So when we return, we'll be joined by a special guest who will help us to dig in to this topic just a little bit more.
Get your day started right. Sign up for the Men's Daily Devotional at mensdevo.org. That's mensdevo.org. They're short, sweet, and to the point. Read them and share them with the men you know. And get into God's Word daily.
Well, good to be back with you guys. Vince Vaughan, thanks for being with us again.
Yeah.
Good to have you. I always enjoy having you. I love what God's doing in your life and how he's using you to minister to people, actually in situations just like we're talking about here, right? Mm-hmm. Clearly today we're talking about ownership. So why do we have a problem with ownership, man? This is it's like a crazy man problem, actually. I think it's actually a problem for most people, but ownership, just owning our issues, is hard for us. Why is that? Why do we have a hard time owning issues? Why can't you own your issues?
I was going to say, I know why I have a hard time owning them. I think it's just humbling, and I don't like having to admit. Yeah. I just don't. I know there's something, I can feel it in those moments, where it just feels like, no, this feels wrong. There's something instinctive that feels like this is just wrong.
I shouldn't have to do this.
Right, it's like animal instinct or something that pushes against it. So I know for me, I have to override that. Yeah. And, that's in a way
that's a good way to say it. That's a good way to say it. We got to override that impulse. Like we got to put a pause to it and say, wait, I want something more. Mm-hmm. In fact, that would be my next question. It's like when people are looking for hope and recovery and sobriety and freedom from addiction or whatever issue it is they have in their life, we know we want this thing over here. It's called healing.
Right.
But we have to get through this ownership issue over here, right?
Right.
We want this, but we don't want to do this. Mm-hmm. Is it that we don't want that really bad enough, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think we want it, the healing, for sure. We just either may not realize that ownership is really a piece of that, or it just, like I said, it just doesn't feel like, it's kind of like yuck, So is there some way I can get around that? There's got to be some way, right?
Yeah. So we don't want to embrace the suck, right?
Right, exactly. So, yeah.
I've always kind of wondered too, like in this particular situation that we're talking about, recovery, sobriety, addiction, whatever it is we're trying to overcome, right? Mm-hmm. That if we just don't understand the complexity of all the things that we need to own, and we ain't been taught how to own things.
Right,
Right.
yeah.
How to own our issues. Like, what's the right way to do it? We want to just skirt past them, traverse around them, ignore them, pretend like they didn't exist.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Because you've done that, right?
Right, for
I have
sure.
too. Pretend like they just don't exist and then just move past them into this new reality that's just better for us, when really owning some of these things actually help to shape and to reshape and to form us along the way. So, I think there's some levels of ownership that are actually easier than others. I talked in the monologue today a little bit about, there's the fact that we need to own that something happened back here, that we need to own something about our present situation. We may even need to own the fact that we want this for ourselves, want betterment for ourselves, not because other people want us to do it. But then there's certain things that we pass over truly owning that build trust with other people, right? There's this level of trust that says it isn't just a behavior I'm reconciling, it's the fact that I've actually damaged something along the way, whether it be a relationship with a spouse, relationship with kids, relationship with the law, relationship with a workplace, et cetera, et cetera. We want to own our behavioral issues, but not the ramifications of the behavioral issues.
Right.
Do you think that's true? That the complexity of it gets kind of tricky?
Yeah, I really do. What it makes me think of is like in like the 12 steps, for example. There's the steps that talk about, okay, I need to confess this, something. I need to own it. Then I need it, probably is good to own it to someone else, just like a friend or pastor or something like that. And then there's later step that says, I actually need to go to the person that was affected. And that is one of the hardest steps for people to do, and understandably, right? Because you're then having to deal with some of the ramifications, the consequences of that. And that's really tough, because we know we may have hurt someone in this process, but I think that's actually where then the healing starts happening.
Yeah, that's really good. So the text that I'm looking at today, which really, really well, it's a story between King David and the prophet Nathan, right? And Nathan's going to confront David about his sexual sin. But it isn't just sexual sin. He's put someone to death. He's connived a situation. He's allowed someone to move in with him at this point. He's taken that child that Bathsheba gave birth to, in as his own son. I mean, we're talking about the massive concealing of one sin that led to another, that led to another, that led to another, right? So essentially God confronts Nathan and tells Nathan to go confront David. Now, Nathan comes up with a pretty cunning plan in 2 Samuel 12. He decides to make up a story and to go confront David with the story. And you have to remember, David's the king. So Nathan wants to be somewhat respectful. So he makes up the story about these two guys, that one was poor, one was rich, one had one little lamb that he treated like a cat, like a household pet. And then the other rich man had a whole bunch of lambs. And then there's a traveler that comes and visits the rich guy. And instead of taking one of his own lambs, which would have been customary, slaughtering it and preparing it for a meal, he goes to the poor guy, takes his lamb, prepares his pet for a meal in his own house. And of course, in this moment, what happens here is David gets angry. It says actually in verse 5, then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. It's a fictional story, by the way, right? David gets angry against the man and said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. Interesting situation, right? The story continues, and I'll try to be brief, but it says, Nathan said to David, you are the man. We all want to be the man, but just not in this moment, right? And then Nathan just essentially lists and says, God gave you this, and this, and this, and this, and he would have gave you a whole lot more. But you committed a sin against him. And then he confronts him with this, and even the death of Uriah the Hittite. And he said, you did this secretly, and he's going to make this known to the land. And then David responds to Nathan and says, I have sinned against the Lord. Now, this is quite a beautiful moment, because it's one of the great battles I think David fought. In fact, I think this is the greatest battle David ever fought, was this one with his own heart. And it's the fact that he has to turn to ownership. Okay, so now we dig into this text a little bit, and I just want to ask you a few questions that kind of follow a dialogue here, but what was special, do you think, about the way that Nathan handles this moment with David? What's unique about how he does this to get him to own these issues?
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's like you could imagine Nathan thinking about this, right? Like, how am I going to get through to the king? Like you said, like it's the king, And so
he could get his head lopped off.
Yeah, right. It's pretty risky. So there's a lot of courage there, which is probably instructive in and of itself. That sometimes we need to have courage, maybe to help a friend.
Right.
And we have to be very sensitive in the way we go about it. That comes out of true concern.
Yeah.
So I think maybe that's what we see here with Nathan is courage, but real concern. Like I think he genuinely wants to help David and says, well, maybe by presenting it as a story that will appeal to David's good heart. He really still has a good heart. By appealing that way, he can actually bring a change there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there is, it is kind of cunning, isn't it? He used real basic logic to get him to see the illogic in his own behavior. Right?
Yeah.
And I think it's funny because it's mildly laughable because of the way that he does the story, that David gets that infuriated at this fictional story.
Yeah.
And really who he's getting mad at is getting mad at himself.
I know, man.
Maybe because he's deeply aware of the injustice.
Yeah.
Do we sometimes get angry the most about the injustices that we perpetuate on others, that we see others do to us?
Right, exactly. It's so ironic and like
irony is the right word.
Yeah, it's like embarrassingly ironic in the sense that we'll get so upset, and we're kind of judging or annoyed, by this something that's going on for someone, and then later you're like, oh, I do that, and that's probably something about because of that it triggers that.
It triggers that. It triggers. Now I'm connecting the fact that this logic over here may connect to my own situation. I am this guy.
Right.
This is who I am. You are the man. Mm-hmm. And the way that Nathan does it is beautiful, for sure. It's second to none. I mean, I'm not that sharp or cunning myself, just so you know. But the way that he does it is beautiful. And it draws to attention just basic logic and says, look, you're doing this to other people. Now, the question I have about this is, do you think David actually gets it? Does he actually at this moment own his issue? Mm-hmm. Do you think? What do you think?
I think so. It's interesting that the logic is what appeals to him, because I think what happens when we're not owning things, it becomes very illogical, right? Mm-hmm. We start justifying, rationalizing, and all of that, and that's what he has been doing. Mm-hmm. And then when he's faced with logic, it's very clear to him. Look, clearly, this is what should happen to this man. Which shows you that he has not been thinking logically about himself. But once he's presented with it, it's like so abundantly clear. So I think that's when his good heart, which is underneath, once he sees the logic, is like, that is me. And so I think when he sees it clearly, then he genuinely
responds to it. So his response here is genuine. And we sometimes can see that in other people. That's where trust is beginning to be built again, right? Like the exchange of trust is being reconciled. It's being restored.
Right.
And I would agree with you too. I think the way that he responds, especially at the end, is very indicative of a changed heart at that moment. The fact that he owns it. He says, I have sinned against the Lord. He realizes it wasn't a sin against Bathsheba, even though it was. It wasn't a sin against the kingdom, which it was. It wasn't just a sin against this child. It was a sin against God, in essence, that he has sinned against God in the action and all the subsequent behaviors and all the cover-up. And he realizes the ramifications of this moment. He's going, wait a second, I'm accepting ownership of this. I've sinned against God first. And I think that's a beautiful end to some of this cycling that he's been cycling in on, and some of the illogic. So I'm asking you to conjecture here. Why do you think David stayed in the cycle for so long of hiding behind this sin? Why?
Yeah, well, again, I hate to have to admit that I can relate somehow, but I think what happens is the bigger it gets, the illogical, the rationalization, it gets that much harder than to stop it or go backwards. You just have to kind of keep working it, spinning it, and I think that's what happens. It starts so small, it really starts with him just noticing her on the rooftop or whatever. So of course, if he'd have just stopped it right then, not too hard, right?
Right,
But the
right.
further it goes, the tougher it gets. And it requires even greater levels of humility and
Right.
all those things. And like we said at the beginning, so I think that's counterintuitive, counter to our nature to want to humble and just be humble and fully admit something. So the bigger it gets, man, it ratchets it up.
Right.
So that's my guess.
I really like that because I think that's a good place for people to kind of really, I would say, focus in on this message today, especially around this whole idea of ownership is the longer we live in the lies and in the non-ownership, the more character it's going to require on the other side, not to just muster up against it, but it's going to require of us greater challenge, greater character, greater trust on the other side to forcibly move against that issue. And that's sometimes the rabbit hole that we don't realize that we're navigating through, especially when we're moving through sobriety and recovery, through maybe the abuses and the damage of the past. It causes us to unravel a whole lot of things. And it requires more and more courage, not less of it, more of it to be able to embrace those moments. And maybe it's going to take longer periods of time. Is that true as well? Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I think for sure. Sometimes it gets more complex, so it may take time to figure out really what was our part. What do I need to own here? What does it look like to take ownership? All of that, yeah.
So in other words, we're just not going to get over this thing tomorrow, even though we
Right.
want to. That's the hard part, right?
Yeah.
Like we want to just kind of move through reconciling marriage, move through reconciling hurt and pain from abuse, and get to the healing side, but it just doesn't happen that way, especially sometimes when it's been unjustly and unfairly done to us. I mean, we're talking about a sin here in this situation that David perpetuated.
Right.
What about the damage that was done to the families
Right.
and the loved ones, and even to Bathsheba in this situation? The ramifications of that might even be greater.
Right.
And take longer. And while David's like on this side of the situation, Bathsheba may need more healing than he does.
Right.
Because she's victimized
Right.
through some of this, right?
Yep.
But his abuse of power and sex, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it sounds like to me that maybe a good place for us to start today would just be owning one issue at a time and continuing to pursue the ownership down a path of healing, understanding that healing will come. Right? But we've got to own everything. And I think really one of the big things that people fail to own is they fail to own the process of their own recovery. That sometimes they get into the process of recovery or moving into sobriety and they're doing it for other people and they're not really doing it for themselves.
Right.
And there's a big step of ownership there too. There's positive, in other words, positive steps of ownership where we need to own the right things as well. So if a person was to get started with ownership, would you just say take one first step? Is that what you would say?
Yeah, I would, because I think it's like a lot of things where it probably would help to start with something small, actually. Either the first step in a bigger issue or just something small that happens. It might be a small argument, let's say you got into with your spouse or, something like that. And just to say, okay, what does it look like for me to stop, ask God to show me my part, to be humble in that, and then specifically go and own that. So walk through that, see what that feels like. Know that God's with us, that he loves us, because I think that's important to this process, to say, hey, I'm walking with, but to get the feel of it, and might kind of build a little bit of confidence, you might say, to be able to do that with some larger issues.
So that's what we're in today, is exactly with that. So build confidence with taking ownership. Like just do one small step of ownership, whether it be a challenge you face in your marriage, a challenge at work, a challenge with a friend, a son, a daughter, whoever it might be. Own something and experience it. Experience what that feels like and watch people respond to it. And then figure out how to take the next step and the next step and the next step. Just one step at a time. Along a series of a lot of steps, not just one that's going to untangle the whole hairball. Right. So guys, thanks for being with us. We'll see you right back here again next time for another episode.